This is my 2007 Honda Fit, and if you've seen my review, you might notice that it looks a little different. Well, that's because I gave it a wash. Except you probably couldn't actually notice that because you're looking at it through a window. So why am I filming this indoors rather than on the other side of this wall, outside on the driveway where you'd actually be able to see the car and be able to admire my capacity for cleaning compact cars completely? Well, there's people out there, and they'd be able to see me and hear me, they'd perceive me, and they'd all start laughing, and then they'd run inside and head to their fridge and grab all their firmest fruits and vegetables and start chucking them at me. You might think it sounds crazy, but that's exactly what happened last time. Anyway, we've already determined that the Fit makes a pretty great car. But can it be a good truck? Today we're going to be chopping off the back to make an open bed and then installing a hitch to see if you even need a truck if you have a Honda Fit. Okay, I just lied. We're not going to be chopping this car up, but we are going to be installing a hitch. You see, I have this quad, and it's been sitting unloved at my parents' place for the last 2 years. I had in my mind that I needed to get a truck before I'd be able to start using it again, but then it occurred to me, maybe I didn't. The 2007 Honda Fit has a towing capacity of 2,000 pounds. Now, every source I found for that also followed it up by saying that experts recommend that you do not tow with your Honda Fit, as doing so could void your warranty. Well, I don't have a warranty, and experts have never seen my Honda Fit. Besides, my quad is very light and I don't plan on towing it long distances. But before we can find out how well this system will work, I need to install the hitch kit. So let's do that. In theory, this should be a pretty simple installation. The hitch kit claims to work with all existing holes and doesn't require any drilling. And the wiring harness, it claims to be all plug and play without any need to splice or cut any wires. But it's almost always the simple jobs that wind up taking the longest. Well, this didn't wind up being one of those simple jobs that turn into a whole ordeal. The installation actually went quite smoothly. You could even say it went off without a hitch. Only that would be a lie for multiple reasons. For one, there was a literal hitch involved, and while the installation was quite straightforward, I still ran into a couple problems. I started off with the hitch, which is a draw-tight Class 1 hitch rated for 2,000 pounds, and is designed specifically for the Fit. I chose this as it didn't require any holes to be drilled, and was also the cheapest option. The installation was super simple. I started by removing the rear skid plate, which I was a little surprised to discover is metal. I had just kinda assumed it would be plastic, but turns out it's a little more skookum than I thought. With that out of the way, the instructions wanted me to start by running a U-bolt through the tow hook and then loosely bolting the hitch to that. This was the hardest part of the job. It would have been a joke with 2 people, but I was doing this installation on my own and finding it very hard to hold the hitch in place with one hand while trying to run the U-bolt through the holes in the hitch, keep the hitch level, get the washer and lock washer onto the end of the U-bolt, and then start the nut with my other hand. It didn't help that my head-mounted GoPro was not wanting to remain head-mounted. Eventually, I realized I was just doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Which I believe is the definition of sanity or something like that, who knows. Regardless, I decided it was time for a new approach and tried holding the rear of the hitch up with the jack, allowing me to use both hands to start the nut on the U-bolt. This took a bit of finagling, but wound up working out much better than attempting to just use my arms and hands. With the U-bolt attached, all I had to do was grab the skid plate, the 3 remaining bolts, line up the holes in the hitch and skid plate with the holes in the car, and reattach the skid plate on top of the hitch. With the hitch already being held mostly in place by the U-bolt around the tow hook, this was significantly easier for me to do on my own than the first step. Then, seeing as this will be responsible for ensuring the things I tow remain behind me, I figured it would probably be a good idea to make sure everything was torqued to spec. And just like that, the hitch was installed. So that means it was time to get the wiring harness hooked up. Wiring always intimidates me, so I was glad that this harness claimed that no wires would need to be cut or spliced. It took me a bit to wrap my head around the instructions. The main thing tripping me up was that it said for the Fit, you had to use the blue 3-pin connector, not the green one. But there were no blue wires on the harness, only green. Eventually, I realized this wasn't referring to the wires on the harness, but rather the connectors in the taillights of the Fit. There's a blue one and a green one. With that figured out, it was pretty simple. The biggest issue I ran into here was when I was unbolting the nut that holds the taillight assembly in to use for the ground, and dropped my 8mm socket into the taillight assembly. Thankfully, I was able to squeeze my arm in far enough that I could feel the socket with the tips of my fingers and was able to very carefully lift it out. I'm not completely happy with how the wiring harness wound up. The trailer connector didn't fit through any of the drain holes in the car, so I wound up just running that through the bottom of the hatch, which is far from an elegant solution. And the driver's side taillight cover is currently just slightly loose with wires hanging out from it. The double-sided tape included to attach the wiring harness control box to the side of the car also had no stick to it whatsoever, so that's currently just loose too. I plan on cutting a small tab in the plastic cover so that the wires can fit through in a less messy way, and getting some actual usable tape so that the control box isn't just lying in the trunk loose. As for the trailer connector, I'll probably just leave it. I don't want to have to drill out any of the drain holes, and this way I can keep the connector in the car when it's not in use, which is good since the cap for it broke when I was trying to put that on. And now, with everything installed, it was time for the moment of truth, to discover whether my fit actually can tow my quad, or if I just wasted a bunch of time and money for nothing. On the drive over to my parents' place to collect the quad, I was thoroughly impressed by how well the fit was handling towing the trailer. It's not a heavy trailer by any means, but it's not super lightweight either. It is a steel frame. Aluminum would have been preferred, of course, but I got this for $200 from a buddy I race with, so I wasn't about to complain. Besides, the fit was pulling it like it was nothing. The tires I have on it now are a little oversized. They're 215/60/15s, and my summer tires are 205/60/15s, so not much better. And they do occasionally scrape in the rear wheel well when going over bumps or if the car's loaded up with items or passengers. So I was worried that with a trailer, the rear tires would just be rubbing the whole time. But they weren't. They weren't rubbing at all. And while I could feel the trailer bouncing around corners or when going over uneven sections of the road, the car was never getting pulled around by it. And when accelerating, it didn't feel bogged down. It just felt like I was driving it normally. Once I got to my parents and loaded the quad onto the trailer, it was time for the true test. Sure, the fit had proven itself capable of towing an unloaded trailer with ease, but how would it handle a load? The answer was, perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, very well. The rear tires did scrape a couple times when turning at speed or going over bumps, but they were still scraping less than they did when I had the rear fully loaded with tires. I could definitely feel that I was towing something now. The car was accelerating somewhat slower than usual, but otherwise felt fairly normal. The brakes and suspension were handling the task of towing much, much better than I had ever anticipated. And even when I had to head up a fairly steep hill, the fit was able to make it to the top and perform a hill start with next to no difficulty. There's something about towing stuff that just feels so great. I don't know what it is exactly. Maybe it's just satisfying the part of me that as a kid wanted to be a trucker. Maybe the next thing I install on the fit should be a CB radio. But to be towing something in a relatively small, compact car feels even cooler to me than to be doing so in a truck or SUV, because it's kind of absurd. I know that in Europe it's not an uncommon sight to see a car with a trailer behind it, but here in Canada it is exceedingly rare. If someone thinks that they might need to tow something someday, maybe, perhaps, potentially, eventually, they buy a truck. There are so many trucks here. And I get it, trucks are a ton of fun to drive. But I happen to like driving small cars a lot more than I like driving trucks. And I've never found that I needed a truck enough to warrant getting one over a car. so it feels super satisfying to be able to do some quote-unquote truck stuff in a hatchback. All in all, I've just been incredibly impressed by my fit. It's truly a jack of all trades. I can now use it as an in-town commuter car, an autocross car, and as a hauler. It's not the best at anything, but it is surprisingly good at everything that I've thrown at it so far. Thanks for watching. Go tow something with a fit.